to another edition of Phil's Morning Drive. This is a quick look with the 2017 Chevrolet Camaro. This is the SS Coupe. So it has one of the biggest engines that you can get in this car, over 400 horsepower. It's a V8, naturally aspirated, and it very much feels like a muscle car. We're up here in Northern California where I've been able to borrow this vehicle. It's bright yellow, so it gets plenty of attention. And we're testing it out on some of these twistier roads to see how it handles. You know, typically muscle cars are not known for their handling. They're known more for their straight line performance. So we're trying to see how this car feels on some of these switchback roads and going up and down hills and things of that nature. Obviously it's still rear wheel drive. It still has a traditional setup, but having over 400 horsepower in this car, you know, I drove a Mustang GT not that long ago, and if you read my article on that, you heard me talk about how it really doesn't feel like that much power. And I think I'm starting to get jaded by the fact that so many cars have turbochargers on them. So these naturally aspirated engines sound like they have a lot of horsepower on paper, but when you actually get them out on the road, what does it really feel like? And being in the 400 plus horsepower category is a good place to be. But the question is, does the power come on strong, and does it feel like the type of car that, I mean, does it feel like a muscle car? That's really the thing. I mean, a lot of folks want to say, is it a sports car? Well, to me, a sports car typically probably has two seats, definitely rear-wheel drive, maybe all-wheel drive, and also possibly mid-engined. Whereas this car feels very long, it feels very big. It definitely feels like a muscle car. And the way that you press on this gas pedal, you really have to get into it before it starts to really take off. And you can hear the noise. It has a great sound to it. The exhaust is great on this. And so it definitely sounds like a muscle car, but before the power happens, it feels to me like you have to press a little bit harder on the accelerator than what I'm used to. I actually used to own the sister car to this, the Pontiac Firebird. It was from the mid to early 90s, and that car felt very different from this. It's definitely made a big change when they brought the Camaro back. This car does not feel anything like those early 2000s or 90s cars, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The one nice thing now is that you really don't have to upgrade to this SS model. Yeah, it's got a throatier exhaust note, and it has a nice feel to it in that sense, but there's so much horsepower now in the 6-cylinder version, it's really not necessary for you to upgrade to this unless you're just somebody who maybe used to have an SS and you just kind of feel a little sentimental about saying, well, the last one I had was an SS, the one my dad had was an SS, so I really have to get that. So it's not really necessary performance-wise, but then again, I guess a muscle car isn't the most necessary of vehicles anyway. This particular model is the SS, the 1SS is what they call it, and that's why you're noticing that we have cloth seats in this. These do not have the leather seats, but this particular one does have a sunroof, and it does have the touchscreen up here, although navigation is not included in there, but it does have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. It also has automatic climate controls, which are kind of funky because you have these big rings down here that look like you're going to open and close your vent, but those actually are what you use on the outside to adjust the temperature up or down on the left side, and then on the right side, closer to the passenger, is where you can adjust fan speed manually. I like to put things on 70 or 72 and then just hit the automatic button. But the steering wheel itself is leather wrapped. It has some nice stitching on it. It has a really good feel to it. I've driven this car about 500 to 600 miles in the last 3 or 4 days, and I can tell you that driving it on the freeway, driving it on some very twisty roads, right now we're out here by the coast. As you can see, there's a lot of fog out the window. It really feels good in your hands. It's got these nice thumb rests. You've got paddle shifters back here if you want to do that. The 6-speed manual transmission is standard. This one does have an automatic, and you can shift manually with the paddles, or you can use the bump shift once it's in drive down here. Another nice thing about this steering wheel is you have the nice 50 logo here, the 50th anniversary, obviously, of the Camaro being 2017. So I mentioned this being the SS. It has a V8. It's a 6.2-liter V8 that puts out 455 horsepower, which is really quite a bit. What's really crazy is you're getting about 250, 275 horsepower out of the 4-cylinder version of this, which is almost as much as what you would have got out of a Z28 back in the 90s. So it's really insane to see the difference in how much power has been added to these engines. Now, one thing I will tell you, that the muscle car feel of this, it takes a little bit. You kind of have to get into it, and I think part of that is because of the different drive modes. There's a button down here that has a couple arrows on it that say mode. So when it's in like the standard mode or the normal mode, it seems like you really have to lay into the gas pedal before things really start to happen. Now, if you put it in track mode, then it seems like it kind of wants to lunge a little bit, and so finding a balance between that, you really just have to kind of control that yourself using your right foot. But 455 horsepower is really a lot, especially in this category. $36,000 is the base price for this car. This one's going to run you probably closer to that $40,000 mark when you add things like the sunroof and, of course, the automatic transmission. But really, that's pretty comparable to other cars in this segment, the Mustang, the Challenger, with this amount of power and this amount of features. The only real complaint I have is I really feel like navigation should be included for that price, and I also think this needs leather, and I think it needs heated seats as well. Neither one of those things are in this car, even though it's $36,000. If we talk about gas mileage, it's really not that great. It gets about 17 miles per gallon in town, up to about 25 miles per gallon on the highway, though, for a combined of about 19, especially if you're doing mostly driving in the city. Now, I've done a little bit of both on this trip. We've done a lot of highway miles, probably in the last, couple of hours or so, and so we're reading closer to that 25 mile per gallon mark. One thing that is nice about this being a V8 is this does actually have the cylinder deactivation program. So at certain times, if you put it in a certain mode here on the driver information center on your gauge cluster, you can see when it's operating as a V8 and when it's operating as, well, technically a V4, because it will shut down 4 of the cylinders. So that really helps with that highway gas mileage. If you're just cruising along, maybe you've set the cruise on about 75 or so, it really helps with that, the cylinder deactivation. And there's a lot of different companies that have been doing things like that. So let's talk about some of the cons on this Camaro SS. Well, number one to me is you're spending $36,000, $38,000, maybe even $40,000 in this case, and you're not getting leather, you're not getting the nicer bucket seats as far as that goes. That's really a big con to me. I don't really like cloth seats in general, but I feel like at this price point, it really needs to have leather, because this is pretty far up the Camaro food chain, let's be honest. Another big con on this car has to do with the back seat. The back seat is basically unusable. As you can see, I'm getting in here. I'm almost 6 feet tall, and I basically cannot fit at all. You know, the back seat of the Mustang is a little bit better because it actually dips down farther, so your rear end sits a little bit lower, therefore the headroom is not as big of a problem. I think the sunroof is really what the issue is, because it kind of sticks down a little bit more because it has to have a place to go. But really, if you're very tall, it's not going to be comfortable to ride back there, even for a short distance. So I think that's a pretty big con. Also on the cons list, visibility. It's very difficult to see out of this car, especially if you have a car that has a lot of glass, that the windows are big. It really takes some getting used to. This side window here, like, I can't even get my head through here. So if you're going through a drive-through window or like at the bank or something, it's a little bit challenging. You kind of have to turn your head and do stuff. I guess I have a big head. I don't know. This opening is really not very big. And the same is true out of the front. There's this gauge cluster really sticks up kind of high, and it doesn't really seem necessary to me that the opening that's right in front of your face is really about like that. And so it just takes a little bit of getting used to. After driving it for the last 200 or 300 miles or so, I've gotten used to it. It does have a very nice backup camera, so backing up isn't too much of a problem because you can't really see much out of there either. Really, that's a big con. I really don't know why they didn't put bigger side mirrors on this car either. I don't really get that. It's just visibility all the way around is a little bit of an issue, and so I definitely recommend that you test drive it and see if that's going to be a problem for you. Now, some folks will say, you know what, Philip, these cons don't matter. Who cares about the visibility? Who cares about the back seat? Who cares about the gas mileage? I'm interested in having a muscle car. I'm a Camaro fan. I even like this yellow paint. I think it looks really great. The wheels are great. It has Brembo brakes. And so they're going to be able to compromise on some of those things. And that's really what a lot of muscle cars and sports cars are all about, is saying, what are you comfortable compromising in the name of performance? Well, in this case, I think you should consider it a two-seater and just don't expect to get used to this visibility very quickly. You know, the trunk space really isn't bad. The issue with the trunk is simply that opening. Once that trunk lid opens, you can see that the opening itself is really not very big. But once you can kind of maneuver a bag around and get it in there, if it can fit through the opening, then you'll have plenty of space to add 2 or 3 things in there. It's just a matter of getting them through to begin with. So what's the verdict? Should you buy a car like this? Well, I think if you're a Camaro fan and I think you're looking for a muscle car. This has a great exhaust note. The wheels look great. This yellow color is really sharp. The car has really grown on me after driving it for so many miles. I'm really starting to like it a lot more than I did when I first got in it. So I highly recommend that you take a good long test drive, especially if the last Camaro that you were in is one from the early 2000s or the 90s. This feels very different from that. It feels a lot boxier. It feels a lot more kind of cramped, but that's okay. This is certainly a viable option compared to the Mustang or the Dodge Challenger. All three of those companies, to me, have just continued to try to one-up each other, not just on power, but also on features as well. I have to say, after driving this car for 4 days and over 650 miles, I was a little sad to give it back. When I first got in it, the lack of visibility and the way it responds to your throttle inputs was overshadowing what my experience became by the end of the trip. It handles twisty back roads better than any other Camaro I've driven, and the exhaust note conjures up images of every V8 Camaro I've ever been in the presence of. Is it better than a Mustang or a Challenger? I honestly don't know. I do know people who've had nothing but Mustangs, and they won't even look at a Camaro, and vice versa. For me personally, there are things I like about both. The exterior looks of the Camaro I really like, especially this latest iteration. In a world that's rapidly changing automotively, it's refreshing to get in a modern car that is fun to drive and has an old-school feel. The number of compromises you have to make is part of the charm. These days, people don't want to compromise on much of anything, so good for you, Chevrolet. The 2017 Camaro isn't trying to be something it's not, while at the same time not apologizing for what it is. Thanks for watching this edition of Phil's Morning Drive. You can find a lot more of our content by logging on to our website. It's simply philsmorningdrive.com. We'll see you next time.